Wāmai, kia orana and welcome viewers. I'm your host Javed Khan and welcome back to Darpin the Mirror, a panorama of images capturing you and the world around us. Now, firstly before I begin, I want to quickly congratulate the Silver Ferns. They're speeding through to the finals. I don't want to jinx anyone just yet, but in saying that, Australia is speeding through as well as England. So go the Kiwi girls, make us proud and get through to the finals and get that world championship. Now, today's show we have an absolute cracker. We have an in-depth interview with Dr. Paul Buchanan, a known authority on security issues. Now, as you will see later on, he is critical of the Prime Minister in her prejudicial remarks against the 17 that were arrested and later released on bail. Also, he talks about political cowardice upon the Attorney General who passed the buck to the Solicitor-General. So without further ado, viewers, let's cross over to Dr. Paul Buchanan.
Kia ora, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
At the very outset, please describe terrorism, or how one should define terrorism from international and domestic perspective.
Well, I think terrorism is the use of political violence against innocent civilians or non-combatants in public spaces during their everyday lives in order to sow irrational fear and terror and panic amongst the population at large in order to bend them to the political will of the people perpetrating the terrorist act. So it's political violence, but it's political violence for symbolic purposes. It's not a military style violence, and it's designed to affect the population psychologically, so then the political interests of the perpetrators can be affected.
You've stated that dodgy politicians and security agencies are setting aside huge budget to serve their selfish ends.
I think that there are many unscrupulous politicians who have an interest in seeing security agencies expand. And they may have that because they have xenophobic feelings towards other people. They may have very conservative views about the social order, and so they want more security. And of course, the bureaucracies themselves will welcome any expansion in their powers and their finances because that's what they call the bureaucratic imperative.
The SIS and the police miserably failed in Ahmed Zawi's case. The whole drama of nationwide arrest in the name of terrorise was in itself a terror act by the police to terrorise communities?
I don't think that they deliberately set out to terrorize communities, and particularly the community in and around Ruatoki. I do think, though, that the police sometimes are either naive or insensitive to the harm that they cause when they conduct raids against entire communities when they're only looking for a select few people. Because in a sense, what they're doing is they're blaming everybody guilty or accusing everybody of being guilty by association, when in fact they were only interested in a handful of individuals in an otherwise peaceful community, in the case of Ruatoki. As far as the other activists who were arrested, they were taken out of communities that basically had nothing to do with their activities, and you can imagine that their neighbors also, if not terrified, were certainly startled by the events of October 15th.
The events that have unfolded since the recent anti-terrorist operation 8 in Tuhoi and elsewhere have left many whānau and communities confused, hurt and traumatized. Politicians have urged people to withhold comment or criticism until the judicial process has been played out. But the flaws in the process to date, plus the very real hurt that has been caused, particularly in the Maori community, calls for some clarification.
Do you agree with Dr. Peter Sharples when he says this episode has set the race relations clock back 100 years?
No, I don't. I think that actually it has set the relationship between, or relations between Maori in general, Tuhoi in particular, and the police back nearly 100 years. I don't think that the races themselves, there's many of us who are quite sympathetic to what has happened to Tuhoi, and the events in Ruatoki were as appalling to Pakeha as they were to many Maori. So I don't think it's race relations per se. However, the relationship between Maori and the police clearly needs some revisiting, because this has tarnished it, and it already was pretty strained.
For sure. What repercussions and ramifications do you see emerging out of this whole situation?
Well, I see good and bad. I'm not sure which one is going to prevail, so it's left for others to determine. The good is that in light of the fact that the Solicitor-General was wise enough not to charge any of the people rounded up with terrorism offenses, we can have a healthy debate about what constitutes a terrorist conspiracy in a rather peaceful place like this. If we were on the front lines of the so-called war on terrorism, then perhaps this legislation that has just passed would be justifiable. But in New Zealand, I think we would need to take a step back from the fights of others, the conflicts of others in other parts of the world, and consider what our geostrategic climate is and what our threat environment is all about. And quite frankly, I don't think that our threat environment is such that we need to have terrorist legislation when criminal law is quite sufficient to deal with these type of threats when they emerge.
Mm-hmm.
The Attorney-General, Dr. Michael Cullen, indicated that he has full confidence in the Solicitor-General and agreed to have the terror legislation reviewed by the Law Commission.
There are calls for the evidence to be put into the public domain, but noted lawyer Moana Jackson is of the view that some parts of it might read out of context. What is your opinion on this?
Well, I think that's very true. I think that the evidence can be quite prejudicial to the various accused now on firearms offenses, and it can be somewhat beneficial to the police. But actually, if we look at it objectively, public interest was so high in this matter because people needed to know, and one would argue that in an informed democratic society, we have a right to know whether the charges were bogus or not. And so presentation of the evidence, I think, is a reasonable thing to do, fully understanding that there are negative consequences on all sides of the table. For example, a good lawyer could argue that the publication of the police's so-called evidence in major newspapers and what fatally undermines their case against these people because they can't get a fair trial. Sure. And so I think that the police, although they may be able to say, well, now you know why we felt we had to act, on the other hand, may lose their case by allowing what appears at this point to be the selective leaking of some of the evidence against these 16 folk.
Solicitor-General David Collins, QC, announced that cases against 12 of the Harawira 16 did not warrant prosecution under the Terrorism Suppression Act, but could go ahead under the Arms Act. But while commending the police investigation, he described the terror legislation as complex and incoherent, and said it should be reviewed by the Law Commission. He said it was almost impossible to apply to domestic terrorists.
3 weeks before the arrested 17 people were set on bail, Prime Minister Helen Clark is accused of making prejudicial remarks when she said the people in question were involved in the use of firearms, constructed Molotov cocktails, and trained themselves in how to use napalm.
Well, I certainly think it was unfortunate that the Prime Minister would speak to the evidence that she had ostensibly seen, because it does, in fact, give the appearance of prejudice against the defendants. Many people know that what she referred to as napalm is a incendiary material that falls a little short of the real thing, and which is very commonplace in rural communities. You know, there's various sort of incendiary mixtures people can make. So I think even there, it's a little bit of a stretch to say that these people had napalm, when in fact what they may have had is some low-grade incendiary device, which again is not uncommon in many communities.
There is discontent among the members of the public on the Attorney-General passing the buck to the Solicitor-General. What factors do you think prompted this action on his part?
Oh, I think political factors weighed very heavily in that decision. We do have to understand, of course, that Michael Cullen is not a lawyer. So his designation as Attorney General in the first instance was somewhat odd, one might argue, from a lawyerly perspective. But assuming that he's a very intelligent man and he understands issues of the laws, it's very clear that he wanted to dodge this one as quickly as possible, because it is a political football. And that raises the question as, why did they do this at all? You know, one of the things that if you're going to use the first time the Terrorism Suppression Act in New Zealand, and instead of using it against supposed external enemies, you are now going to turn on well-known political activists and dissenters, you would think that you would take into account the political context in which you're about to invoke this law, a political context that on the one hand may see a lot of Pakeha very worried about Maori activists getting all feisty in the bush, but on the other hand, which may see a backlash for the use of such draconian legislation on people who, again, are well known to be dissidents, and in fact, whose activities many people were aware of and simply treated as a nuisance. So I think that there was some, I hate to say it, but there was some political cowardice on the part of the Attorney General to not front up and make the call himself. And there was some political naivete on the part of the police to decide to invoke this law for its first time against this particular group of people and at this particular time, especially when we consider that there's going to be an election next year.
Isn't it ironic that the same Attorney General, who allegedly took a few minutes to run through a pile of evidence, about 500 pages, against a visiting Israeli military officer, Moshe Yaalon, and ordered abandonment of the arrest warrant issued against Yaalon by Auckland District Court Judge Avinash? Do you think this is ironic? Have you got any comments to make on that?
Well, it is ironic, I must say, although I'll give Michael Cullen the benefit of the doubt. There was no way that the New Zealand government was going to allow the arrest of a very highly ranked senior Israeli military officer while he was on an unofficial visit to this country. There was no way diplomatically they were going to let that happen. So of course he jumped real quick on that one. On the other, but we have to remember that had to do with international relations. In this instance, it has all to do with domestic politics. And so in this case, he could do the more cowardly thing, if you will, or he could pass the buck to a lower ranking person, whereas in the case of the diplomatic row that would have ensued had he allowed the arrest warrant to go through, there he did take responsibility because, quite frankly, in the eyes of the Israelis and probably the international community, or the Western international community, he looks good by doing so.
It has been recently revealed that the Australian police are under directions to charge as many people as possible to test the veracity of the new anti-terrorism law in Australia. Do you think the New Zealand police is under similar direction from their masters?
I think that the Australians are far more heavy-handed in their approach to all security issues, and in particularly now to this new terrorism threat. And we've seen what are actually quite grotesque excesses on the part of the Australians, both their intelligence services as well as their police, towards innocents, detaining them on purported charges, trying to concoct charges and what have you. So their approach to testing, their very stringent anti-terrorism legislation, quite frankly, strikes me as unethical. We will see in New Zealand security agencies, again, for their own bureaucratic reasons, will want to test all of this new terrorist or anti-terrorist legislation, which is part of the reason why we need to debate whether we need that legislation in the first place. It could well be that we need to give the police a little more latitude under the Crimes Act to pursue people who are involved in politically motivated conspiracies to commit murder or to commit some act of violence. But that in and of itself does not justify having a separate body of law oriented towards political crimes, crimes that are called terrorist crimes, which includes the crime of association. You may not commit the act, but if you are related to someone who is, and that degree of relation is not determined by the courts, it's determined by the police, then you can be called a terrorist as well. And I think that so long as that legislation remains on the books, then it will be an imperative for the security agencies in New Zealand to trial it, although I don't think they're going to act as heinously as the Australians have.
Sure. What do you see unfolding in, say, in the next month regarding Tūhoe and their backlash against what's happened within the Ruatoki and Opotiki community, and also on side of the police. What do you see from each side as being the next step?
Well, I know that the police, and I guess to their credit, or perhaps out of necessity, but they are already engaging in fence mending exercises with Tuhoe and with the Maori community at large. I think the critical issue in the next month is how the Maori political class, if you will, responds to this.
Sure.
If they unite behind Tuhoe and they make some demands on the government, which could include, for example, the resignation of the police commissioner, then I think this has serious electoral implications next year, because the Maori Party is going to be the swing vote. Where the Maori Party leans on the issues that are of importance to it may in fact be the determinant. And this, of course, has now cast all of that out into the open. One thing that I've been struck by is that Tamaiti's causes were marginal to the political debate of the nation up until 3 weeks ago. That he was a interesting figure.
A theatrical based
who
figure.
Very interested in political theater, who engaged in symbolic acts of dissidence, but who was not central to the political debates of our time. He now is. And we can thank the police for that.
Sure.
Now, I don't think the police, again, thought about elevating Tamaiti's cause to the center stage of New Zealand politics in the run-up to an election, but they have done so. The issue now is how the Maori political community will react to this. If they unify behind Tuhoe, this is serious problems for both of the major parties. On the other hand, if they don't come and support Tuhoe in the measure that, quite frankly, Pakia think is unified and wholehearted, then we're back to politics as usual.
It was really great hearing your perspective. I really appreciate your now being in New Zealand, and also from your perspective from also being from overseas. It's really good to see that you have a much bigger picture of you can see it in perspective. So as far as you're concerned, and I'm sure a lot of in New Zealand it feels quite big, but it is fairly small on the terrorism map of the world. I think our little 5 seconds.
I think we're off the radar scope of
so.
most of the major terrorist events. Well, always remember, with distance comes perspective.
Sure. Great. Thank you.
Coming up next.
Why would I borrow money to build grandstands at Eden Park when the government has 2,600 million in a piggy bank?
Next week.
Clearly, Parliament doesn't understand what incoherent means, and perhaps what's going on here is they decided to pass the amendment, get the bill wrapped up, sewn up, now that the Prime Minister can designate terrorist entities and what have you, and then review the whole thing, which to my mind is a little bit of a waste of taxpayer dollars.
Up in the Mirror on satellite, cable and terrestrial network.